Good evening. Happy New Year's. Call the workshop meeting of the Board of Trustees of the Portland Water District for January 13th, 2014 to order. And we have one item on the agenda tonight, which is a history of the Portland Water District, which will be presented by Paul and Barbara. This has been done in the past. So there may be one or two of you on the trustees that have seen this before, but I think it's probably new for most of us. And I understand it's very well done, and looking forward to hearing the presentation. So with that, Paul?
This is a presentation that, as Trustee Cody said, has been done before. It was put together about 5 or 6 years ago in the process of preparing for our centennial celebration, 100 years of the Portland Water District. I was asked to research and put together a presentation about that 100 years. I'm not a historian, so that's my disclaimer at the beginning. I'm an environmental guy, but so any mistakes I make, you historians in the audience, just be kind to me. But since I gave the presentation 5 or 6 years ago, Barbara Brewer has been hired at the district, and she's been archiving a lot of the district's old maps and photos and publications, and in the course of doing that has read a lot of the background information that I skipped over. I was focusing a little bit more on the pipes and the pump stations, and Barbara has learned a lot about the people behind that, and so I asked if she would partner with me on this presentation. When I reach a point that there's a good people story behind it, I'll turn the microphone over to Barbara and she'll fill you in, and then I'll continue on with the pipes and the pump stations. So this is how the presentation is organized. Like many things, understanding our 100-year history, it helps to know the prehistory, what came before that, because a lot of the way the district operates is related to or is come out of what happened before we ever became the Portland Water District. I'll talk about the early years of the district, some of the major projects that the Board of Trustees puzzled over and decided on in our first, say, 20 or 30 years. And then I'll go through kind of the growth of the water system. It's about 5 times as large as it was when it was established in 1908, when we began operation in 1908. So I'll talk about how that growth has happened. We also have a very distinguished history of treating wastewater for the greater Portland area, and that history is not as long but is equally distinguished. And so that I'll go through briefly the history of our wastewater system, and then finally at the end of it, a lot of what we do we have been doing for 100 years, the same sort of activities, but we use different tools to accomplish the same things that our predecessors did many decades ago. And so I have a section at the end to show you how we do things now and how that same activity was done before. If you were to pick a moment in time when the Portland Water District was conceived, it would really probably have to be the Great Fire of July 4th, 1866. We didn't exist at the time. In fact, there was no public water system to speak of in Portland at the time. There were cisterns and wells and even some small piping networks that served various houses and neighborhoods, but there was no centralized or centrally operated public water system. And there was a lot of debates about it. If you read the old newspapers, there were debates about should we have a public water system. People would complain in the summertime that there wasn't enough water in the systems that they were using, but then the city fathers would say, well, it's too expensive, or it's not logistically possible, and then the debate would go on for another year. It would start raining, and so the crisis was passed. Finally, in 1866, the city of Portland, a good percentage of it burned. It was on July 4th. Ironically, the fire department, a lot of the firefighters were on holiday because it was the 4th of July, and they were out at Sebago Lake picnicking when the fire broke out. The fire broke out on the peninsula, of course, down on Commercial Street. It started down here, and the reports of the time say someone playing with fireworks, firecrackers, near a boatyard, caught fire. You can see which way the prevailing winds were going up this way, and the fire jumped from building to building very quickly. By the time they got it to fighting it, there wasn't really enough water available, trying to get water out of the ocean. It was low tide. So they had a very hard time putting the fire out, and it was so windy, it jumped very quickly. And at the end of the day, that area that's darkened there is the area that was burned in that fire. In the end, this is just a summary from the newspaper of the time of what burned. Now remember, most of Portland was on the peninsula at the time. A lot of the parts of Portland now were actually other communities, but they've now been incorporated in Portland. So the eight churches were destroyed, 8 hotels, every newspaper, all the banks on the peninsula, and every lawyer's office in the city were all burned in that one, all congregated in that area. I have a few pictures of what it looked like. This is what Congress Street looked like after the fire was put out. So from a water district perspective, this terrible tragedy did end the debate about whether a public water system was needed to serve the peninsula. It didn't take very long after this, after the fire was finally put out, to end that debate. This is what Munjoy Hill looked like. This is 1866, so I'm guessing those are Civil War surplus tents. People were rendered homeless, many thousands of people. So anyway, I think there's this was posted in City Hall about where people could come to get food. It was devastating to the city. So again, the whole question about should we have a public water system ended, and immediately the process was started. Now the original water system was, the original charter that the legislature passed in 1866 was for a privately owned for-profit water company known as the Portland Water Company. And they began operation actually in 1866 they were chartered. The first drop of water from Sebago Lake flowed in 1869 on Thanksgiving Day. Danforth Street was where the first service was turned on Thanksgiving Day. By the way, there was one debate at the time, should they use Long Creek, the Presumpscot River, or Sebago Lake as the source? And after the Great Fire, it was, Sebago seemed like a long shot because it was the furthest away, it was going to be the most expensive, but after the fire they said we're going to Sebago Lake, and that's what took 3 years, was to put that pipeline in. The Portland Water Company had almost a 50-year history. They had the basic design of the system was to bring the water from Sebago Lake up to the peninsula, and then there were 2 open-air reservoirs. Now, we don't have any of these in our system anymore. This is after the water. There's no more treatment coming after this. The water was open, one on the west end and one on the east end. This one, this is the Bramhall Reservoir. It's right near, it's no longer there, but it was sort of, if you go up to Maine Medical Center now, right on the sort of the corner there, it's sort of a triangular shaped lot. That's where this reservoir was for about 50 or 70 years or so. Again, we don't have any open, post-treatment, open air reservoirs, but they were common at the time. And this is the other one, which was on the other end of the peninsula at Munjoy Hill. And this is a photo taken 60 years later. The standpipe was not there when the reservoir was first constructed. That was constructed later. But this reservoir, I'm not going to go into a great deal of the history of the Portland Water Company, but the most significant event in the history of the Portland Water Company, the most memorable one, relates to this Munjoy Reservoir, and Barbara's going to tell you the story of that.
The Munjoy Hill Reservoir was completed in 1889, and it was designed to hold 20 million gallons of water. The Bramhall only held 12 million, so that you can see that by comparison it was a lot larger. And in August of 1893, just 4 years after it was complete, 2 women were walking around the reservoir early in the morning, and they noticed a trickle of water coming out the exterior wall. There were 4 houses that were right underneath that exterior wall, and they became concerned, so they started knocking on doors of the houses. And most of those residents were, quick to get out. But at one house, the woman appeared at the door with her 2 daughters, and then she went back inside. So a neighbor's son went over, and he entered the home to convince them to come out, explaining that there was danger imminent. And within seconds, the house was gone, and all 4, unfortunately, died. The man at the house was actually a night watchman, and he was just coming home from work when he saw the debris that was his house and family. And after this, an inquest was held over several days. The cause of the break was attributed to a defective overflow. But the reservoir was rebuilt, and it was kept in service for the next few decades.
whenever you're doing research for history research, you find these little nuggets where you're like flipping through and you go, whoa, I can't believe this. But upstairs in the attic, I guess it's called, we call that the attic, I found this ledger that had, it was like a accounting ledger from the Portland Water Company that's still up there. And I found this entry that after this, tragedy, they settled with the family that lost 3 members for $6,600 for all damages associated with that. Just was sort of, because I'd seen this picture and I'd heard about it, and then to find this kind of, I don't know, brings it right down to kind of the sort of a bottom line thing. There it was. That was the last action on the part of the water company related to that break.
So, as Paul mentioned, a standpipe was added to the reservoir. It was added in 1903. And this is a picture postcard off the Facebook site called Portland, Maine History, 1786 to Present. And this shows the standpipe with the reservoir behind it. The small house in the foreground was actually occupied by Fred Rennie. He later became the general manager of the district from 1933 to 1949. But in 1920, he actually lived there, and he patrolled the rim of the reservoir every morning to make sure that it looked safe and sound. That was just after World War I. But during World War I, they actually had armed guards who patrolled the rim just to make sure that the water wasn't tampered with.
Thanks. Probably unfair to the Portland Water Company that the only story we really share about their history is the most tragic one. But as you if you read the newspapers from the late 1890s and into the early 1900s, there was a lot of debate in Greater Portland about whether a water company should, if it was really appropriate to be a for-profit water company, or whether a non-profit was a better model. There was questions about just the idea of profits being made off of drinking water. And there was no TV, there was no radio, so all the debate was played out. And you can read it in these newspapers of the time, just columns and columns of debate about the water company saying we're a well-run company and our rates are comparable to other cities, and other people saying this is wrong, no one should be profiting off of this. But anyway, finally in 1906 there was a vote. The city of Portland had a vote to determine whether they would continue operation as a Portland Water Company or whether the water district would be established. And this cartoon, or you've probably seen it before because it's up in various places around the district, including right there. But I mean, there's just so much symbolism in all this. You have the rising sun of socialism on the horizon. You have these steamships with workers and working class coming across the ocean, and then this wave of municipal ownership crashing all the infrastructure of this for-profit company with a monopoly crown on with dollar signs on it. Anyway, this was the way it was framed at the time by this newspaper anyway. And in the end, the vote was about 3-1 in favor of establishing a not-for-profit water district to take the place of the water company. So once that happened, then a legislative charter was passed to authorize that, and the new trustees of the water district approached the leadership of the water company and said, we'd like you to open your books and allow us to analyze the whole work so that we can establish a fair price. And the response was, our books are sealed, make us an offer and we'll consider it. And so what do you suppose happened next? The trustees, moved to condemn the entire works, went to court, and it took about a year. Engineers were hired and financial experts to kind of go through the books and understand all the various holding companies and the sort of the complicated finances of the water company, as well as to establish, what was the value of the infrastructure that was in the ground. So tests were done to determine capacity of the system and all. In the end, the entire works was determined to be worth about $4 million, and there was about $3 million in debt. So about $1 million changed hands. And so in 1908 is when the district began operation as the Portland Water District. And of course, times were very different then. This is a postcard I found from 1910 of what the Western Prom looked like. Dirt roads, and it was a very different city than we know today. I love that South Portland just has one house in this postcard. And this is one of the first pictures that we found. And I don't know that we couldn't, Barbara tried to match up the faces with the trustees, because we have pictures of all the trustees since sort of the beginning of time. And I don't think she could find any. So these are not trustees. These must be employees of the water district around 1914 or 1915. As the environmental manager, I just love, where it says they test 15 samples of water every day. I think we test our water and wastewater about 16,000 times a year now. So anyway, this was about 1914 or so. Okay, so when the district was established, one of the first major projects of remember that the water company was established because to fight fires. That was really their primary concern, was there wasn't enough water in case there was a major fire. Great irony is that when the district took over operation, they determined that the system used about 9 million gallons a day, and you could only push about 10 million gallons from the lake into the city in a day. So if there's ever a major fire, ironically, you wouldn't have had enough water to fight a major fire, despite the fact that that was the main reason that the company was established. So the trustees immediately started working on a project that, if you read the old annual reports, they don't refer to it as a new main. They refer to it as the new main. It was a major undertaking because it cost about $1 million for land and infrastructure and design, and the whole works was only worth $4 million. So this was an enormous undertaking, but it was to put a new transmission main from Sebago Lake all the way into the city to replace this one. This picture was taken in 1980 when a piece of this main a section of it was removed. I think this is Ward's Hill in Standish. It's what the people who've been here a long time call the tin main, which always makes me think of the Wizard of Oz for some reason, the tin main. But it was sort of like wrapped and then riveted and then lined with cement on the inside. And I think that was a 24-inch or so, but it just didn't have the capacity to push enough water into the city. So it was replaced, and it was replaced with, as I say, was referred to in all the early annual reports as the new main. It was about a 3-year project to get all the rights of way and then put in the new main. This is a picture of that project coming through Gorham and Westbrook, the 42-inch cast iron, and if you are drinking water tonight, you're drinking water probably out of the 42-inch cast iron, because it's one of our 2 trunk mains that we still use today. It's something that we can all be proud of, that the district tends to build things that last, and we've been using this main for over 100 years. And when we've carved into it recently, it's in unbelievable condition. It looks like it hasn't been in there, more than a few weeks. It's amazing how little it's deteriorated over 100 years. And this is another picture of that same project. I love this one with all the sections of water main all laid out across the farm field. But it was about 3 years from when you first see in the annual reports that they're talking about it until it was finished. Near and dear to my heart, the early trustees also, in addition to talking about the new main in all the early reports, they spent a lot of time talking about protecting Sebago Lake, the source of drinking water. And if you read the newspapers of the time, 1908, 1909, 1910, it wasn't common on the front page for there to be, deaths from cholera or typhoid right on the front page of the Portland paper almost daily. And there was never any link that I ever found in any of the newspapers that linked the deaths of the typhoid and cholera epidemics to the drinking water, but no one knew at the time. You just knew whatever we need to do to make sure our water is safe to drink, that's what we need to do. And so, in fact, I think most of the public health experts would link it to milk, not water. But at the time, people really didn't know. They just were concerned about, is the water supply safe enough? And at the time, things like steamboats would come across, would go back and forth on the lake and would just dump their sewage directly into Lower Bay. That was a legal thing to do at the time. And a few years later, a law was passed making it illegal. But that was what the trustees were. Those kinds of things the trustees were focused on in the early years. This is a picture taken just about from where the lake office is now, looking out across Lower Bay. This is what the boat launch in Standish looked like in 1910. It's like a dance hall up here, and people would come on the train and up from Boston, New York, and south, and this is how they would get here by train, and then they would get on boats, these little steamboats, and go out across the lake from there. as you know, most of this land is now owned by the district and is mostly forested now, but as you can see, it was not very well forested back then. Within the 2-mile limit, near the outer edge of it, was this peninsula of land known as Smith Mills. It was a section of Standish. There was a DuPont mill here. This is owned by DuPont. And the workers and their families, there was a whole village set up over here for the workers and their families to live. About 75 people worked there at its peak. The district hired a sanitarian through the town of Standish around 1910, 1911 to go around the lake and sort of investigate what are the sanitary conditions like. And his description of the waste from this mill was horrifying to any of us. Just an open trench that he said whenever it would rain, it would just fill up with water and wash directly into Lower Bay. In 1922, DuPont, they'd gone out of business. DuPont offered it to the district. It was purchased for $90,000 for the whole village, as well as the mill itself. Everything torn down, all the buildings removed. I think the next picture, this is a picture from 1930, an aerial image of Smith Mills, and the mill was down here. This is what we call the trestle, still there today. The mill was down here, and then this was where the village was. And so you can see this is just 8 years or so after the district purchased it. So the buildings are gone, but the trees haven't grown back in yet. And so another controversy in Lower Bay took place on Indian Island, which is an island wholly within the 2-mile limit. And Barbara did a lot of research into the story of the battle for Indian Island.
One of the concerns of the Portland Water District was the summer vacationers around the intake. So Indian Island was located just 3/4 of a mile from the intake and had been earmarked for development around 1900 by 3 men who wanted to put on an upscale hotel, a central park, several lots, and just completely develop it. So the Portland Water Company actually managed to block the development but allowed them to put on summer cottages. But the restrictions placed on the use of the lake had prevented them from actually any bodily contact from the lake. Within the 2-mile limit, 1913, there was like a no swim policy that you were not allowed to go off the beach or anything or into the water. And this is an article from the local Portland paper that shows they had 2 famous Broadway actors who had bought land, a cottage there, and they actually had neighbors who were also famous, but not as famous as they were. This is Florence Reed and Malcolm Williams. I probably don't expect you to know the names since they were active between like 1930 and 1940 on Broadway, most famous, and they did also some movies and some TV. Now, they had claimed they had been able to swim before this, before the inspector came and caught Malcolm Williams actually in the water, but I think the problem was that Sebago didn't have an inspector or a boat until 1917, and so that's when they actually got to enforcing those policies. So a stir was created in Sebago when the district inspector confronted Williams for violating the no-swim order by his summer home. Williams appeared defiant. He fought the $20 fine in court, and he based his appeal on the premise that the district did not have any authority to limit his actions. However, the trustees, they did not wait for the ruling on the appeal. They actually went ahead and took the land by eminent domain. And for some reason, they also took their neighbor's land as well. The other actors who made up the actors' colony were penalized because Malcolm Williams went for a swim. So they took those 3 cottages by eminent domain and owned them by the end of 1923. That left just 2 lots that were privately owned on Indian Island, and then within 2 years, they had agreed to sell. So by 1925, the district owned Indian Island in all of its entirety.
And this is just the same aerial image that I showed you before from 1930. So here's Smith Mills over here in the trestle. This is Indian Island over here. And this is 8 years or so after the story that Barbara just told you. And so you can still see where there are you can see where the house lots were. If you look at Indian Island today, it's completely reforested. You can't even see evidence. There are still some old foundations there, but you can't see any breaks in the trees. It's completely grown over now. And notice also Fry Island is here and doesn't look like it has a stick of built house, nothing there in 1930. That's Indian Island close up. Okay, there was also an ice house in Lower Bay in the turn of the century. There weren't refrigerators. You had an ice box, and so blocks of ice were cut from Sebago Lake, pushed up this ramp, and then carted into the city for people to use in ice boxes. Sounds very romantic, kind of like It's a Wonderful Life or something, but the sanitarian's description of this with the mixture of manure and ice and how it was not very well segregated is gross. I mean, if you read it, you'd think, wow, that's what was being scraped off and then brought into to houses in Portland for use in their ice box. The district now owns this property. We call it Ice House Beach. There's still some foundations there, but of course the building is long gone. And then the last early project I want to tell you about or Barbara will tell you about, is the construction of this building, which it was completed in 1926.
I actually have it completed in 1928, okay, just so you know.
I would trust her.
Okay. By 1927, the trustees had come to realize that the shop space at Kennebec Street was inadequate for the growing utility. They asked architects John Calvin Stevens and his son John Howard Stevens to design a new facility to house the construction department, the stock room, blacksmith shop, pipe lining department, garage, and superintendent's office. John Calvin Stevens was a well-known Maine architect who had already designed many municipal buildings, as well as churches and residential homes by the time he had designed this Douglas Street facility. He wanted this new building to combine art with industry. He intended for all the pipes and lumber to be stored behind the building where it would not be visible to the neighbors because this was a residential area. He also didn't want to disrupt the feel of the neighborhood, and he had plans for a park and a landscaped courtyard on the Douglas Street and Brighton Avenue sides of the building. And when the building was completed in 1928, it was hailed by the waterworks industry as a state-of-the-art facility. And John Calvin Stevens gave an address in dedication of the building in which he stressed his belief that employees who work in a beautiful environment will actually be happier and work harder.
What I remember, and you can correct me if I have the numbers wrong, it was $166,000 for land and construction of the building in 1928.
And this sits on top of the copper tower on the building. And John Calvin Stevens, in designing this weather vane, he wanted it to be a replica of the first street sprinkler in Portland. So he found an old photograph that was about 50 years old, and that's where this design came from.
Okay, so the water system that the district took over in 1908 was a lot smaller than the one we have today, and the system has grown over the decades in sort of in increments. And I'm going to talk about the several intake projects from the original one, which was constructed in 1869, to the ones we use today. I'm going to talk briefly about the major transmission mains that have allowed this growth of the system, and then I'm going to briefly go over the changes in treatment over that time, but obviously that could be a presentation all by itself, but it is not going to be. I'll go quickly through that. So these are just for you numbers geeks out there. These are some of the numbers that relate to the district in 1908. 50 years later, and then about 50 years after that, we went from 11,000 or 12,000 services to 51,000 services. There was no treatment at all in 1908. It was just the water was brought directly into the city. By 1958, we were disinfecting with chloramines, and of course today we have other forms of treatment and corrosion control, and we add fluoride as well. We had 937 hydrants, and now we have, these numbers are a few years old now, but about 55 to 6,000 hydrants. One thing that's interesting is we only had 2,512 meters for 11,776 services. So a lot of people got their water bill based on an estimate. It wasn't measured directly. Now we have 54,000 meters in the system. We had about 200 miles of main, and now we have, I think it's over 1,000 now. This number is a few years old. So first I'll talk about the intake projects. The original intake, the 1868 intake, this is it over here. Looking across Lower Bay, sort of from over at the lake office. The intake was 450 feet long, was a 48-inch pipe. It had an ability to pull about 10 million gallons into the system, and it was abandoned, it was in service until 1952. In 1925, this building was constructed, this intake, which is the 25, all named by engineers. The 25 intake, the 52 intake, nothing more creative than that. Just anyway, that's my engineer crack for the day. This intake was 1,580 feet long and a 54-inch pipe. Once that was constructed, then you could pull 75 million gallons into the system. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't other bottlenecks along the way, but the intakes could then, this had a capacity of 75 million gallons per day with the two intakes working. And this one is still in service today. And even though this is prior to the Douglas Street office being built, it does kind of have a John Calvin Stevens look to it to me, but I don't have any indication that he had anything to do with the design of it. Just to give you a sense of where it is and one other project associated with the 25 intake, this is a map of an old map of Lower Bay with Route 237 coming down here and Route 35 along here. So the intake, the 25 intake, if you drive down 237, you see it right ahead of you there, and then the intake goes out like this. But in addition to constructing the intake at the time, again, right between the lake office and the treatment plant, this tunnel was also constructed. And that's because there's a high point there. And so, if you bring water out of the lake to there, you'd have to push it up over that high point to get it down into the city. So rather than pipe it over that, they dug a tunnel through about 2,000 feet long through there. I just point out the lake basin because I'm going to show you a picture of that later. There was an open air reservoir there, smaller but similar to the ones you saw in Munjoy and Bramhall. But you'll see that later, so that's why I wanted to circle it for you. But anyway, this tunnel was in service until the ozone plant was built. This is a picture of it under construction, about 2,000 feet long, 54-inch diameter concrete, and it was abandoned when the ozone facility was constructed. This is what it looked like inside. If you talk to some of the people that have been here 30 and 40 years, they'll tell you that they used to have to inspect it periodically, so it would be drained, and to walk through 2,000 feet, 54, you'd be like this, and so they use this little red wagon that you see down here to kind of go through it and inspect the inside of it. Finally, the last intake was constructed in 1952. This is a picture of that under construction. This is still in service. This building, looks very familiar. If you've been out there, it's a 54-inch concrete intake, and again, it's still in service today. The last intake project I'll tell you about was not a new intake, but in the 80s, the district was having complaints from customers about algae. And the reason is that the intakes were in about 35 feet of water. And in the summertime, when the lake stratifies, you could actually get the stratification down below more than 35 feet into the water. So the intake was actually in the sort of the photic zone, the warmer upper layer of the lake where algae can flourish. And so we would periodically pull algae in, and our customers would see it and complain about it. So what we did is we put these extensions on. We floated them out there. You can see they're sealed up on the ends. They were constructed on shore, welded together, and then floated out, sunk, and then attached on like long extensions on the end of the two intakes. So now the intakes pull water from 85 feet depth instead of 35 feet depth, and we haven't had any algae complaints since then. As the system has grown, it sort of comes down to a capacity problem. If you're going to add houses around the system and you want to get water to them, you have to be able to get the water from the lake, out of the lake, and then into the communities that you want to serve. And we've done that through the addition of these major transmission mains, sort of the trunk mains of the whole system. So I've already talked about the 1912 project. You saw pictures of it. That's the 42-inch cast iron, which goes from the lake just to about here. In 1931, a second major transmission main project was started, and it was completed in 1939 using public PWA labor during the Depression. That's a 48-inch concrete. You're still drinking out of that one today. It also goes from the lake to around this part of the city. In 1954, we put in a 48-inch up into Falmouth. Falmouth was served at the time, but with smaller mains, and they weren't able to keep up with the growth. So we added a 48-inch. And now I'll give credit to the engineers. I picked on them on that last slide, but just think about this for a second. In 1954, the engineers that put in the Falmouth feeder also added a 60-inch sort of a stub that we call it the Rocky Tie Line. There was nothing on the end of it, but it went from Rocky Hill down to the Falmouth feeder. And the idea was someday we're going to put water in storage on Rocky Hill, and this will be the way we get the water out of those tanks. In 1954, the Rocky Hill tanks were built in the 90s. So somebody was thinking way ahead. And, I don't think that far ahead, but engineers did, and so I got to give them credit for that. Finally, in '67, we put in the 42-inch southern feeder down towards Scarborough and South Portland. So just to give you an idea of what where those major transmission mains are and how they allowed the system to grow, what this is showing you in pink is what our service area was approximately in 1908. And these are the major transmission mains that I was telling you about. The 42 and the 48 come down from the lake into Portland. That's these two here, kind of moving in and out through this same route. And then you've got the Falmouth feeder up here, the Rocky tie line right there, and then the southern feeder down here.
Where is Rocky Hill?
In Westbrook. I don't know how to, somebody, I don't know, is that, do you want to know more detail about how, like where in Westbrook? I don't know my geography well enough to tell you what.
North of the mill. Yeah.
Off of Methodist Road?
North of the paper mill. North of.
Do we have water in there?
Oh, you're going to see.
Paul, for future reference, would you repeat the question? The trustees don't have their microphones on.
Yes.
And we are recording this session, so if you would repeat the question, it would be
Okay.
helpful.
Yeah, the question was about the Rocky Hill tanks, which I have pictures of in a little bit, which is here in Westbrook off of Methodist Road. But what you're seeing here in pink is the 1908 distribution system or service area, and then in green is the service area that we serve now, that we're able to with those larger transmission mains. This is a picture of work on one of those major transmission mains. What you're seeing here is molten lead. We don't use this anymore for obvious reasons, but 50 years ago, you would seal up these connections in the pipe, but with sort of a piece of rope that kind of fits in there into the joint between them, and then you would pour molten lead on there because it was flexible, and so it would pour around there and it would seal up that joint. We don't use that anymore, but it was used for many, many years. That was an industry standard. When I first saw this picture, I thought, wow, they don't make them tough like this anymore. These guys are leaning out and holding up this bucket of molten lead. How could they be that strong? Until I stared at it long enough to see there's a chain right up here like this. So there's some kind of a backhoe up there holding most of the weight. Still, I'm sure they're a lot tougher than me, but not quite that strong. This is a picture of the Falmouth feeder being installed going across the Presumpscot River in 1954. I think this is also the Falmouth feeder, although the picture wasn't fully labeled, but I think it was in 1983. I will tell you that there are a number of OSHA violations. If this were today, the job would be shut down. We do things much differently, but this was in 1983. And this is a picture of the Rocky tie line. This is in the 90s when we built the storage tanks on Rocky Hill and then connected them in. So this is the largest transmission main that we have in the system. Oops, I'm sorry. This is a 60-inch here and a valve here. So this is a picture of one of the two Rocky Hill tanks. There's two of them there. They each hold 9 million gallons. And this is the first one under construction in '92. And this is a better picture to give you a sense of this is the finished one, and then this is the second one, which put in a few years later, Rocky Junior and Rocky Senior. I can never remember which one went in first, Rocky Senior first and then Rocky Junior. Okay, so again, it could be a whole presentation about our history of treatment, and I'm not going to do that, but I just want you to briefly see the disinfection history, how water is disinfected. The industry standards have changed over time, the regulations have changed over time, and the district's practices have changed over that same time. So from 1869, when the Portland Water Company began sending Sebago Lake water into the city, until 1914, there was nothing added to the water at all. It was just water. But by 1914, it became clear that disinfecting the water with chlorine was a good idea. So it was free chlorinated from 1914 until 1938. In 1938, the same project, I told you that the 48-inch transmission main that we're still using today was put in using PWA labor in 1938. It was a Great Depression project. Similarly, the chlorine building was rebuilt in 1938, and we began adding ammonia and chlorine in combination, which is known as chloramines, which is becoming more and more the industry standard, but we've been chlorinating almost as long as anyone in the country. I think, or certainly in the state of Maine, I think there was one or two other systems chloraminating before us, but we're one of the first. And now a lot of systems are moving that way. but again, we've been doing that for almost 80 years. In '94, we began adding ozone as our primary disinfectant. We still add chloramines as a secondary disinfectant. And beginning this year, we're going to be disinfecting with 3 disinfectants. We're going to be ozonating, adding UV disinfection, and then chloramines on top of that. I told you that I would show you a picture of the lake basin. This, we don't, obviously is out of service now, but if you drive down 237, when you get to that farm on the right-hand side, you're bending around the corner. If you look to the left, you can still see this sort of depression. It's now grown in with trees now, but this was where water was pulled out of the lake, and then it was basically to stabilize the system. So you had water already pulled out of the lake for sending it down into Portland. This is a very rare picture. When I found this was another one of those, wow, this is cool. I never saw this before. But this was our first chlorine building from 1914 until 1938. I don't think it was torn down, because now I'm going to show you the chloramination building, which was on the same location from 1938 until 94, which is still there today, but we just don't chloraminate there anymore. But I think it was a rebuild of this structure, because that's what it looks like. And if you notice, like see how the doorway has this kind of inset brick around it, and if you look at the newer building, which was constructed in 1938, you can still kind of see that door looks the same. So I think they rebuilt that building and added ammonia addition here as well as chlorine. And as I say, this building is still sort of in service, but it doesn't do what it used to do. We don't add any treatment here. That's all done at the ozone facility. Speaking of the ozone facility, it was constructed in 1993, 94. So this is laying all the rebar down for the contact tanks and other things. Further along in the process, and then this was the building, say, 6 months or so before we opened up and started treating there. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the wastewater system. Its history begins sort of in the late 60s, early 70s to present. And the prehistory of that would be, does anyone know what this is a picture of? That's East End Beach in 1954. I mean, it looks like Coney Island, I mean, it was very popular, it was very crowded, but in the 50s, if you read the old newspapers, there were a lot of concerns about bacteria in the water. The beach was closed a lot because of bacteria concerns. And this was a time when all the wastewater from the peninsula just flowed downhill and directly out into Casco Bay or into Back Cove. And that was standard practice in cities around the country at the time. So by the late 50s, East End Beach was closed. You couldn't swim there. This is Higgins Beach. And this isn't a combined sewer overflow, which is, there are still combined sewer overflows today. When the system is overwhelmed with rainwater, you do get untreated water washed into Casco Bay, but this is actually just straight, this is sanitary, this is the way you disposed of sanitary wastewater in the 1950s and 60s. Probably kids played down here because the water would be warm, I'm guessing. We used to play in storm drains. I don't know about you, but we did. Didn't know any better. It just was warmer, it was kind of fun to play there, but anyway, I survived it somehow. But this was, again, a common practice. So here are some milestones in the process of developing a wastewater system for Greater Portland. One thing that happened in the late 60s, a lot of American cities were talking about doing wastewater treatment. The question was how to pay for it. So in the late 60s, the district approached the communities of Greater Portland and said, look, if our charter would change, our charter only limits us to doing drinking water, but we would be willing to serve as a wastewater treatment provider for the communities as well, if that's what you want. And many of the communities said yes, a few said no, they would rather do it themselves. So our charter was changed to authorize the district to be the wastewater treatment provider for those communities that wanted it. So in 1971, a master plan sort of how would you, if you're going to treat water for these communities, how would you do it? That was completed in 71. And then, of course, the big moment was in 1972 when the Federal Clean Water Act was passed, which included significant funding. It required that American communities have fishable, swimmable waters, but the key is that it had a lot of funding to allow that to happen. And so many, many cities around the country built wastewater treatment plants at that time. In 1978, the Westbrook-Gorham plant was completed, in part using that funding, and then the East End plant was completed in 1979. This is a grainy old picture from the newspaper of the Westbrook-Gorham treatment plant under construction. I know that because there's only 2 clarifiers here. If it was East End, there would be 3. This is what the Westbrook-Gorham plant looked like about when it opened. You know, there are now covers over these clarifiers. There weren't when it was first completed. And this is aeration. You can see this aeration train is full of wastewater. This one's empty. This was one of the largest construction projects in Maine history up to that time. It went on for several years, and if you look at the old Portland newspapers of the time, almost every day there was a front page picture of this project, some aspect of it, because it was just, it went everywhere through the city. The treatment plant itself at East End was a massive, engineering project. But I think, my personal opinion is that the interceptor sewers is a more impressive engineering achievement because, so here's Commercial Street, and of course all the sewer laterals came down these streets and carried sewage directly into the bay. And so what the interceptor does is it's about as big as me, maybe it's 60 inches in diameter, and it runs along Commercial Street like this and intercepts all these sewers coming down so that wastewater can be conveyed over to East End. So to put a 60-inch sewer main all the way along this street, say 25 feet below the street surface, while business is being conducted, that's pretty impressive. I wish I wasn't old enough to, I was alive then, but I wasn't really sentient at the time. I wouldn't have known what was going on probably. But that just must have been an impressive sight to see that going on for about 3 or 4 years until it was completed. This is a picture, a grainy picture from the newspaper of East End, the original kind of excavation at East End. East End, that site was a dump. And so they had to remove a lot of the trash to build the foundation for the plant. And this is a picture of the dump waste being hauled away. And this is, again, from the newspaper, a grainy picture of one of the clarifiers here, all this rebar. You can see some workers for scale right about here. I think that might be a person standing there, or maybe not. Maybe that's a piling of some sort. But anyway, and then this is the tunnel. If you've had a tour of East End and you've been downstairs and seen that tunnel, I mean, it essentially extends from one end of the site, from the building, the treatment plant building over here, all the way down to this end. I drove into that for 5 years, probably drove in, for meetings. I didn't work in wastewater at the time, but I went to some meetings there, and I never went downstairs to see this. And when I first went down there, I just stepped in. It's just like it's like an airport runway through there with all, and as soon as I saw it, I thought, well, of course, you wouldn't want to dig a hole every time you had to work on a pump. So it made sense that it was there, but I just didn't even think of it. And all those years I drove in there, but there is the tunnel right there. And this is the East End plant, the skeleton of it under construction. And this is the plant before this is the primary settling tanks over here before there's any wastewater in it. They're covered now. The aeration tanks are here. They're not covered, but then the clarifiers are over here, and they are covered now. In fact, this is a picture from 1982, a few years after the plant opened, when it was decided to cover the 3 clarifiers. And you can see 2 of them have kind of the skeleton of the cover on them, and the 3rd one doesn't yet, but those all are covered now. And, a lot of the discussion when the debate was going on about should the city or the cities embark on building this treatment plant, one of the questions was, well, if we do, will we be able to reopen East End Beach? And the good news is within a year of the treatment plant opening, East End Beach was reopened. Now it's periodically closed even to this day, but I'm certain that the water quality is much, much higher than it ever was before because raw sewage used to flow right into Back Cove. Okay, so the last part of our talk is about sort of then and now, how we did things then, how we do them now. And Barbara has some of the history of this right here.
In 1932, the Portland Water District asked employees to submit their suggestions for a slogan that was going to be used in marketing its water supply. Employee Raymond Moore submitted the winning slogan, Portland's greatest asset, pure protected water, for which he received $10. And that year, the district established what was known as the Union Station Spa, which is pictured here. Union Station first opened in Portland in 1888, and by the 20th century was the main transportation point for tourists. To promote its water quality, the district manned this booth from June through September, in which they gave out free cups of Sebago water. and actually a pamphlet that would give statistics about the district. And the winning slogan you can see is right at the top of the spa, except for there's one alteration. Instead of pure protected water, it says pure Sebago water. And this booth was maintained from about 1932 to 1954. And in 1952, 43,100 cups of water were distributed to Union Station visitors in the weeks June 23rd through September 2nd. So they did a lot of business in free water.
This is an excerpt from the 1946 annual report. It lists, all the employees of the district and their salaries at the time. It's public information just as it is now, but I found it interesting. Of course, I have, this is 1946. I have 2 daughters. They would be mortified to see that at the time, the best paid female clerk made less money than the lowest paid male clerk. And it wasn't anything that was sort of secret. It was publicized directly in the annual report. This is from 1955. There's a lot of commentary I could make on this, but certainly OSHA would have a field day with this. You have one guy down here dragging this board in here for some reason. You've got kids sitting on the edge of the excavation. You've got, I don't know, there's some citizens stopping by to see what he's doing. It's almost comical, but that's 1955. This is a water bill that you would get today. If you're a customer of the district, this would look familiar to you. It has a lot of useful information about your past usage. It has a Celebrate National Drinking Water Week note in here. So that's what a water bill looks like today. But if you go back in time, this is what you would have got this is from 1888. So this is actually the Portland Water Company's water bill to a customer in 1888 for $20. That's an annual bill, and it's obviously based on an estimate. And then we found this rate card, which, again, when your water bill was determined, it was based on what you were using water for. And so someone apparently would come out once a year and kind of evaluate what you were doing. A private dwelling house occupied by only one family, not more than 4 people, that was $10 a year. And then an additional family would be another $10, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a couple of things that are fun in here. Like if you have more than 2 horses, you pay an extra $3 a year. I gotta believe that people would loan their horses to their neighbor when they knew that the water company was coming. Also, if you were in construction, for each cask of lime or cement, you paid an additional 7 cents. So they really got in there, and I guess you had to keep records of what you used water for, and then they calculated your bill. Workers, so here you go, Trustee Levinsky. It doesn't look, certainly in 1984, people dressed more like, in work clothes. There's actually 2 people in this picture, even though it's 30 years old, who still work at the district. John Libby and Tony Alvis were on the crew back in 1984, and they still work for us today, 2 of our more valued employees here. But here's 1964, and I don't know, it kind of looks like the same group. It's not. This is probably their fathers and grandfathers, but kind of dressed, kind of rough looking, pretty rugged looking. I don't think I'd last on that crew very long. And then if you go back even further, this is the Peaks Island crew that I mentioned earlier, wearing kind of overalls, again, kind of rough smoking, tough, rugged work. This crew put in the submarine main out to Peaks Island in 1920. Before this building was expanded to add the customer service part of the building, it used to be you went to Casco Street in Portland to pay your bill. There was the laboratory was here. Engineering was here, and customer service was here. This was a shop. This building was used as a shop. So you'd go to Casco Street to pay your bill, or for the engineering department. So here's a picture of what a workstation would look like today. This thing over here in the corner is what we call a Wise box or a Citrix box. So that's a connection into the networking system of the district. So that's sort of a typical workstation today. But if you go back to 1964, this is a picture from customer service of, it's called an addressograph machine. I'm guessing it has something to do with sending out bills, that you type all the information in there and send it out. But then coming a little forward to 1977, I found this in the Spigot. This was our first computer in 1977. It looks like it belongs on the the bridge of the Starship Enterprise to me. But it was purchased in 1977, and there's an article that accompanies it, so you can get some information about it, that says it had a 64K processor, it had 42 megs of storage, it had 2 monitors, and it cost $66,000 for that computer installed. This is a picture looking over at the lake office over here from what's called Chadbourne's Landing along the shore. This is what it looks like today. It's, mostly there's woods on either side of it. There's a right-of-way in there where the public can come down, sit at the bench there, and enjoy the view. It's no trespassing on the water, so you can't touch the water in here, but you can come to the shore. This is what it looked like in 1923. And even though in 1923, it was not illegal to touch the water. That was a later amendment to the private and special law. So you can see boats were there, and this was sort of a boat landing. This is a picture from 1960, and you can see it was a pretty active boat launch at the time. This doesn't look dramatically different. This fence, either this one or one just like it, is there. It runs along. These trees are a little taller now, but it looks almost the same. But of course, there's no public launching of boats there. Oh, I'm going to get in trouble trying to describe this because I'm not an infrastructure guy, but Gordy, if I say anything wrong, I apologize. But this is to tap a main live. You strap a saddle onto the main, and then you can drill into it and pull a coupon out while the water is still flowing through the main. So what it looks like when it's in place is like this. So the saddle, I think this is called a saddle, Gordy, correct me if I'm wrong, and then this is a gate valve here, and then you kind of drill into it, pull the coupon out, and then you can attach a pipe to it without ever dewatering the main. I think that's how it works. But this isn't new technology, because here's a picture from 1931. It's much larger, but here you can see there's the saddle strapped onto this major transmission main. Here's the gate valve that you can open and close, and then you kind of drill in this way and drill out the coupon. Not sure how this belt drive works, but I'm not very mechanical, so I'm not going to try to explain it. We've always had a fleet of vehicles, obviously, to maintain the system, to work on it. This is kind of what our fleet looks like now. This is what it looked like in 1964, in 1929, and 1918. I love this one. I want one of these too. PWD right on the front of my car. I would love that so much. But then here's 1910. I think it was around 1912 when we bought the first motorized vehicle. So when the district was first established, everything was done with horses. And if you read the old annual reports, it will say oats and strapping. It was like a blacksmith shop, and you had to maintain your fleet of horses with all that entails. But starting in 1912, we started buying motorized vehicles. That's the last slide that I have. Just over an hour, Ron, so I guess I did okay.